Everybody. I'm excited to be here and to go through some of this with you. I will warn you right off the top, you're going to see me looking away from my camera a lot. That's just because I've got the second monitor set up with the presentation over here on the other side. So as Mackenzie mentioned, my name is Melanie. I've been working at MacEwan University for I'm coming on to almost 15 years at this point. Most of my time has been spent with the office administrative program at MacEwan University. And then I've also been doing a bunch of the professional development that is offered through the School of Continuing Ed. So I'll be relying on Mackenzie to relay me your comments and questions from the chat throughout the webinar. But if you knew me a little bit better, you'd know that I'm very happy at any point to have questions, comments, put it in the chat, and I will do my best to answer them as we go. So what we're going to talk about today is this idea of supervising or management, really, and leadership. And we'll sort of talk first about how did we get to where we are today in terms of distinguishing these two concepts? What's leadership and what's management? The second thing then that we'll do is we'll start, after we sort of figure out what's the same and what's different, is that then we'll go through and we'll talk about what actually makes effective leadership in any organization and how actually we can all contribute to being leaders within our organization, even if we are not in management or supervisory positions. Okay, so I'm looking forward to it. Let's go ahead and get started. Sometimes I think having a bit of a background, understanding where it is that we've come from helps us understand where it is that we want to go. So I think giving you a little bit of history here is important. The first thing that we should kind of understand is that we're in what we would consider the post-industrial revolution era. So the Industrial Revolution, it was really about automating work processes for many, 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 many people. And so when we think of automating processes, one of the most famous examples that comes to mind is the Ford factory. Henry Ford hired Taylor, who was came in, he was a scientist actually, came in and he helped Henry Ford basically build the conveyor belt to assemble cars. So in that era, starting then, we really started to use people as tools to help manage the processes. And then in about the 1930s, a fellow by the name of Elton Mayo came along, and he was studying organizational behavior. And he realized that people were no longer interested in working just for the sake of making money. What really happened is that all of a sudden, we didn't need to manufacture in our homes or to grow or create everything that we needed. And instead, we started working to earn money so that we could buy what we needed instead. And so, although originally money was seen as really the motivating factor in the Industrial Revolution that kept people coming into work, Elton Mayo in the 1930s said there's actually a lot more to employee motivation and engagement. And he started essentially the human resources movement. And that was, like I said, in about the 1930s. He was interested in understanding really what motivates and cultivates workplace achievement. So according to Elton Mayo, who's pretty important in this kind of conversation, we talk about the human relations movement. And according to Mayo, there's three things that are really important when we talk about human relations and when we're talking about managing people as resources in our job. And the first one is about teams. And so teams is a critical component of human relations because teams are what really allow people to socialize in their workplace. And it's also what actually motivates people often. If you refer to any communications textbook, for example, one of the values that teams have for workplaces is that we tend to be as employees we tend to be closer to our peer group, to our colleagues, than we are to our managers or direct supervisors. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we relate to our peers, our colleagues, or our team members on an almost day-to-day basis. So it turns out that our peers are typically better motivators than our supervisors in some ways, right? So it's one thing that's really important here as we're thinking about this. The second key ingredient for human relations and approaching this through an organizational behavior lens is the idea of upward communication. And what that really means is that employees have the ability to provide open, honest feedback to management, to directors, to supervisors who will actually listen to them and, sort of take what they're saying into account for making decisions or changing processes or implementing policies, those kinds of things. It increases, individually, it increases employees' sense of value in their work. The third key ingredient is this of good leadership. Good leadership is really about the ability to make good decisions, to have people trust you. And one of the things that can help with this idea of good leadership is the idea that there's really clear and consistent communication between leadership and the employees underneath. We'll talk more, obviously, as we get going here about some of the other qualities of good leadership. But first, I'm going to put everybody on the spot. I would like to know, and Mackenzie will fill me in here, what do you think is the same about positions of management and positions of leadership? What is the same with those two ideas or positions? You can type your answer in the chat if you can find that.
Ooh, our first answer is integrity and respect.
Okay.
Someone says inspiring others.
Okay. We might be a quiet group so far. Don't worry, there's more questions coming, everybody. So if you didn't answer this one, not to worry. I'll give you guys one more minute, maybe something else will come up. What's the same between management and leadership? We've heard integrity.
Someone else chimed in decision-making power.
Decision-making power, yes.
Someone says seniority.
Okay, sometimes these are positions of seniority. Absolutely. I love it. You guys are on the ball here this morning. So ultimately, a lot of what your answers come to is really the idea of power. So leadership and management positions both tend to have the power. Now, when we're talking about power, we're often talking about the ability to influence others or to make changes within the organization. Okay, so when we're talking about influencing others, we could be talking about having them change behaviors. We could be talking about having them change the way they view or see or think things, or see the world anyway. And so although it's important for people in management positions to understand the obligations of leadership, it is entirely possible to have leadership. Everybody has this power to influence others and to affect change. Okay. Typically, when we think of leadership, when we sort of redefine leadership as having the ability or having the power to influence others, then all of a sudden we can start to see every individual as being in a leadership role within the organization. Okay, we all have the power to influence others. So what would be the differences then? And there's a few, but what would you suggest would be the differences between management and leadership? Go ahead, and if you have an idea, please just put it in the chat for us. I'm not seeing anything come up just yet.
Oh, we've got a couple rolling in. Leaders could be peers. Differences, maybe responsibilities. Leadership can happen in any role. Someone else says certain administrative and approval responsibilities.
In terms of that would be the difference between the two. Yeah, I agree. I think you guys are all absolutely starting to conceptualize these very well, consistently with how many other experts in the field would suggest. So it's really the idea that leadership here is about people. It's about having soft skills. It's about building that relationship with people. Whereas when we think of the role of management, it's like one of our participants suggested, it's really more about the administration of things. So it's the operation and the functional capacity of these roles that's often different. Okay. So when we think about it, there's this great quote by Admiral Grace Hooper that I think sort of sums up these ideas pretty well. We don't manage people. You manage things, but we lead people, right? So it's this idea of leadership versus management. We're gonna jump in and talk more about this here. That's kind of our second objective here. So when we're talking about management, we're really talking about short range views often, right? So this is things like scheduling, planning, assigning tasks, delegating, approving time off, all of this kind of thing. Budgeting is in here. The one thing about management is it's actually really pretty easy to see if you're managing things effectively, because there's lots of very quantifiable, right? So there's lots of numbers or that we can assign to measure management. It's easy to see if we are on track. What happens is that we often assume our managers are also leaders. And of course, they're not always. One person doesn't always have the required characteristics to do both. I'm sure we can all think of an example of somebody who is an excellent manager, but didn't generate a lot of respect or a lot of, good workplace culture kind of thing. So we expect them, but they don't always naturally occur together. So thinking about then, who are these managers that aren't leaders, and sort of how could we help these managers or supervisors maybe? So one of the things, does it actually, and let's go back to the chat here. When is it that a manager doesn't behave like a leader? Like, what has a manager done, or what would a manager do that wouldn't make you feel like they were a leader? And again, go ahead and put it in the chat here. So when do managers fail as leaders? What are they not doing? Okay. Inconsistent expectations. I can't, not considering the human side. Yeah, that's definitely this poor communication, all of these things, not leading by example. Gosh, it's like you guys read my PowerPoint slides ahead of time, because it's exactly a lot of what it is that we're going to talk about over the next few minutes here. So the idea when managers aren't leaders, it's sort of often because they do things like they don't keep their word. They don't have an open mind. Yeah, that's another good one. They don't give credit or share credit or responsibility, right? So we think of credit as when things go right, and responsibility is when things maybe go wrong. When they speak poorly about other employees, these are all kinds of ideas of when we have a manager that isn't, yeah, blame, same thing. They're not a good leader. And the fact of the matter is all of these things really do is start to deteriorate the trust within the organization. Yeah. Lack of knowledge here again. It's really about trust. As employees, we want to look to our leadership, whether that is our manager or our supervisor, and know that they care about us as individuals, as human beings who are operating in this work world. And the idea that they're going to share the credit, the responsibility, all of these things, right? And all of this really brings in the differentiation between what we would consider authority and what we would consider power. Yeah, so when we're talking about authority here, we're talking about the right to make decisions, to set directions, to to discipline employees as needed. That's authority. It is the right to make those kinds of decisions. Power is really about having a climate of respect so that when those decisions are made, they are sort of well received, I guess, would be one way to describe it. So we generally require this climate of respect in order to have managers that have power. It's really all about the respect part of it. The authority comes from the job title, right? The power to influence others comes from the relationship piece in our workplace. I apologize, my presentation thing keeps dropping off view here. So thinking then about how we would describe leadership. Leadership is really about the long range view. It's about developing individuals, employees here. It's about influencing their behavior, affecting the change that we want to see. It's about being able to offer opportunities for training and to give feedback in a way that's going to be well received and actually acted upon. The thing about leadership, and this is especially true when we're comparing the ideas to management, is that leadership is much harder to track. It's much harder to quantify. It's much harder to assign a number to how effective our leadership is being, right? So kind of keeping in mind that if what we're talking about with leadership is this idea to influence others, to direct change, to give feedback, and it's all about this issue of climates of respect, then all of a sudden we can start to see how anybody at any level of the organization actually has the ability to be a leader. And most of the time in really good organizations, so organizations that have a healthy workplace culture, you will actually find leadership at various roles throughout the organization, not just in the management roles. So with this in mind, and you don't have to answer this one in the chat, although you're welcome to if you'd like to, can you think of a time where somebody behaved with leadership skills, but they weren't necessarily in a role of management? Okay, that's sort of what I want you to think about. Think about a time that you witnessed leadership that didn't come from management. And it's this idea that we all have the ability to do that. And again, any questions as we go, feel free to put those in the chat as well. I did find my chat bar here, so I'm sort of trying to keep half an eye on that as well. So now we are going back to the chat for sure. This is a family feud, audience participation kind of thing. What qualities and characteristics do you think leadership, effective leaders have? What characteristics do they have? Compassion, consistency, empathetic, they're trustworthy, they're brave, courage, yes, open mind, yes. These are all, I would say, very consistent with ideas, with at least with our contemporary ideas of what makes leaders effective, right? So ultimately, what it comes down to is that good leaders are those that are trusted and respected within the organization. Most of what we're going to look at next is some very specific characteristics of effective leadership. But as we get ready and sort of jump into that part of the presentation, I really want you to start conceptualizing that leadership is always really about the outward facing approach. So it is about empowering everybody who is around us to do better, to be better, to work better, all of those kinds of things. It's a very outward facing approach. And I'm not asking you all to, fall on your swords. It's not, it doesn't have to be in a self-sacrificing way. The fact of the matter is, this outward facing approach doesn't really cost us as an individual anything. It's just the ability to be supportive of those people that we work with. It's never about how we're going to get further ahead. Leadership is always about how everybody else can be improved through their work. So again, you don't really have to do much except maybe shift your focus on the leadership qualities. So the 4 leadership characteristics that we're going to talk about in some more detail here is this idea of influencing behavior, constructive feedback, opportunities for training and development, and then this idea that we're going to lead by example. Somebody here mentioned courage as a leadership quality, right? It's this idea that we can sort of stick to the objectives, even in the face of disappointment, that we can make the decision, even when it's not a popular one, those kinds of things. And somebody else mentioned this idea of open mind, right? So the idea that we're flexible and we're open to new ways of doing things. All of those are sort of also kind of part of the backbone here. So let's talk first about influence. Carrie Patterson in the 80s wrote Influencer, The Power to Change Anything. And his book was seen as fairly revolutionary at the time. And a lot of the concepts from that we've actually just adopted into our regular sort of ideas and workplace culture. The idea with influence, according to Patterson, is that we really can break up spheres of influence into sort of 6 different areas. So one of them is that we always have to consider the question of motivation. Why do we want people to do this thing? Is it worth them doing this thing? And on the other side of that is the ability to do it. So when we're talking about influencing behaviors, in particular workplace behaviors, we have to ask ourselves the question, number 1, is the person going to be inclined to do this? And do they have the ability, the skills, the resources, the tools to be able to do this job effectively? And when we go into these sort of 6, so there's these sort of 2 parts to the influence, but there's also sort of these 3 realms of influence: the personal, the social, and the structural. When we're talking about personal motivation, kind of the idea that these new behaviors, these new workplace behaviors, they can be boring, they can be scary, they can be uncomfortable. So good leaders will help people understand what may be holding them back on their personal motivation. We don't all have to become therapists to sort of, be able to do this well. What we have to do is just have an honest conversation with somebody about, I noticed that you're not interested in doing this. I'm wondering why. I'm wondering if we can talk through this. Or sometimes, if you're really observant, there might be a similar characteristic between 2 different tasks that shows up. And then you might be able to say, well, what's common with this employee on these 2 things, and what does that tell me about their personal motivation? Personal ability, this is really just the idea that effective leaders will influence other people's behavior by offering them the training and development so that they have the ability to do what it is that they want to do. Social motivation, social ability, this is where we really leverage the teams that come into our workplace. It's about this positive peer pressure that we often have, and sort of understanding that there is inevitably strength in numbers. So how can we sort of collectively, how can we influence the collective to do that? Structural motivation and structural ability, this is really about how the workplace is set up. Is it set up so that people can succeed at their thing, right? So are there effective reward systems in place, right? Is there a physical constraint in the actual setup of the workplace that may be hindering the adoption of one of these positive behaviors? Okay. There's some good influencer videos on YouTube, and Patterson passed away several years ago, but there's a bunch actually featuring Carrie Patterson if you are interested in following up with any of those. The next element of effective leadership is really about constructive feedback. I would argue, and I think most experts would agree, that one of the key things to being able to provide constructive feedback is about spending time with the individual and developing the relationship with the individual. As a leader, that helps you because it helps you remember that they are just humans, and they probably feel bad about, a mistake that has been made, those kinds of things. We also, good leaders, constructive feedback is not just about when something goes wrong. That's the second point here. It's this specific positive reinforcement when things go right as well. Okay, so all of this is constructive feedback. And it's the idea that we really are interested in helping them perform better. So when we look at sort of some definitions of those, the idea is that constructive feedback always focuses on the process. It has to be, what is the end result? That's what the feedback focuses on. Destructive feedback, on the other hand, is really those feedback comments that focus on the individual and their shortcomings. I would also say that even when the feedback is positive, so when you're trying to reinforce a good job, you can have destructive feedback, right? So, if you think about telling somebody, oh, well, this is great, you're so smart, thanks for doing this, that's great. But then there's this expectation that they always have to be smart. And they're not always going to be smart. We're human, right? We always, never mind, but inevitably we make a lapse in judgment, right? So those kinds of things. So really focusing on the outcome, the process, what it is that went really well. And again, we're really going to have to limit our scope here to the workplace settings. So constructive feedback, the example is here. Let's review what went wrong so we can avoid similar issues in the future, right? It's about fixing the process or that has gone sideways. In the case of a mistake, when we're talking destructive feedback, that would be something like, you really messed that up. I don't understand how you still don't know how to do this, right? All of that sounds very harsh to our ears. Most of us wouldn't approach feedback this way. But one of the things that I want you to notice on these particular examples is the use of the word you. If you are providing feedback and you're intending for that feedback to be positive, constructive feedback, I should say positive or negative constructive feedback, avoiding the word you is probably the single easiest tip that I can give you. When we avoid the word you, what we really do is we force ourselves to take, in communications, it's called the passive voice. So it's not about the individual. And ironically, this is better for relationships and for treating people as humans than to actually identify them as, you did this, you did this, you did this, right? So avoid the word you. A couple of other tips is trying always to frame your feedback as an improvement. So not as what went wrong, but what needs to go better. That's another good tip. Also, remember when you're doing this is that part of constructive feedback, sort of inherent in constructive feedback, is this idea that we're focusing on the elements that can be controlled. Not on any given thing, right? Things that are outside of control, has to be on something that can be controlled. After we give feedback, make sure that we're verifying the understanding, okay? So that we know what's happened and that they know what's happened, and that we basically have a shared understanding of what this is. The other thing is taking some time. So really understanding that timing is pretty key here. If I think of this time that I'm not joking, I was a waitress at the time, and I dumped an entire plate of pasta all over a woman's lap. You couldn't have given me any feedback in that moment. I was not prepared to take it. I was too emotional. Yeah, it doesn't feel like an attack, right? Yeah, and you're right, Iris. It is about some of this team building idea as well. When you're giving feedback too, one thing that really can help this be received well is to also consider the implications of your feedback and limitations as well of your feedback. So when I talk about implications, don't just say to somebody, this is how you should do it, and then they go ahead and they do exactly what you asked them to do, but it still ended up, with something that wasn't right. So really kind of thinking through all the different ways things could go wrong based on your feedback. And also, when is your feedback not going to work? So if you want to provide feedback to an employee that says, you always have to answer emails within 24 hours, that's fine, except when is that not a reasonable expectation? Okay, good. Training and development. Let's talk about this from an effective leadership position. So effective leaders always are going to support the ongoing development of their employees. It doesn't always have to be like paid professional development, but if somebody says that they're interested in doing something or learning more about something, an effective leader will support that decision. Okay. The other thing about training and development is when we're talking about it, it's sort of the idea that leaders, whether or not we are managers or supervisors, have a sense of responsibility for the people that we work with, right? And so their personal growth and their personal development is something that we are interested in from the leadership part of our job description. The other thing about leading and learning is that we also have to know when we need to learn from others. So some of this has to do with that upward communication that Elton Mayo says is one of the 3 key components to human relations. And it's this idea that sometimes we don't see a problem as a leader with a process until somebody brings it up. I have had several instances in an educational setting where I approach the instructor with a problem and say, this is what I'm seeing. And 9 times out of 10, that instructor will assume that the problem is mine, that it's something I'm doing wrong. And so I have tried very hard with my students when they come to me with a problem and say, this is what I'm not seeing, then I automatically assume that they're correct and that I need to fix something. That's sort of the difference, right? Between effective leadership and ineffective leadership is being willing to learn from others, even when they are subordinate in positions. Okay. Yes, and sorry, just catching up here on the chat, this idea that destructive feedback, not only does it lead to lower self-esteem, but it's often a result of lower self-esteem as well. Okay. In the process, we share outcomes. Yes, this is it. This is leadership, and we're going to get to that. This is the idea of sort of shared credit, shared responsibility. We're going to come back to that right now, actually. Thank you so much for the segue. When we're talking about leadership and leading by example, this is sort of the 4th characteristic that I really wanted to highlight for you today. So this first one is this idea of walking the talk, right? So that there is a congruence, there is sense making that happens between what our leaders say and what they do. I had one boss at one point say that he would never ask me to do a job that he wasn't willing to do himself, right? That's the kind of leadership, leading by example, that we're talking about here. Or if you say to somebody, you know what, as a leader, you set the expectation that this is our required start time for work, and yet you're late 10 minutes every day yourself. That's there's no congruence there between what you say and what you do. Okay. Good leaders, and this has something to do actually with the confidence piece that just came up in the chat. It's about knowing what you value, how you, what you prioritize in your daily work life. And sometimes all we need to improve our leadership ability is just to actually stop and think about, why is this important to me? That's sometimes enough to help reset our focus on those things. And we've sort of talked about this one already, this idea that we have the courage to make these unpopular decisions, right? This idea that when we're leading by example, we're going to do what's right and not necessarily what's easy. And that might not be popular, and it's definitely not the easy way often to do things, but it's this idea that when we behave with a high standard of ethics and integrity, then the others around us will be more likely to do the same. Thumbs up. Thanks, guys. Yeah. Okay. So let's, I'm going to see if Mackenzie can launch a couple of polls for us here. Oh, no, not yet. Sorry, Mackenzie, I jumped ahead. That's okay. Just give the polls 1 second, everybody, not to worry. What do people want most from their leaders? Well, all of these ideas, these characteristics kind of come together to have clear and consistent expectations, clear communication in both directions. So this will help leaders also get buy-in from their employees, but also be open to their suggestions of new or improved ways of doing things, or sometimes even just identifying barriers that we can't see from a leadership position. Leaders have a good positive attitude that make others want to be at work with them. And this idea, and it came up a minute ago in the chat, is this idea of these teams, right? This idea that we are collectively working together and that we have a vested interest in each other's personal success. They also want reasonable recognition, appreciation, and accountability, right? For especially when others are underperforming, that can be important, right? A good leader is going to hold that person accountable for that. So when we're talking about the characteristics, then we tend to think of our leaders as being visionary. They have the ability to see the future. They have a strategy. They have a way that we're going to get there. And the reason that it's important for us to go towards this common vision is clearly communicated all of the time. We also have to think of them as having good critical thinking skills. Can they take on a whole bunch of information and then analyze that information to come up with a possible solution, outcome, recourse, those kinds of things, right? And then the last one is this idea, again, that good, effective leaders are constantly learning themselves. They make mistakes, and when they do, they behave ethically with those mistakes. So some of this is about leading by example. Some of this is about being open to the communication from your subordinates. Okay. Continuous learning. The other thing I'll just mention about this, especially because we're talking about like adult development and learning and those kinds of things, continuous learning actually tends to also be self-generating. So if we see something that we want to learn more about, it often inspires others to figure out what else they need to learn about. And it also often inspires us as individuals to continue that sort of, it's this sort of perpetual cycle of learning, but that's just an aside, really. Here, finally, I apologize. We're ready for the polls. So when we're talking about leadership and this visionary understanding, it's the idea that a vision is really a clear statement of what it is that that indicates the beliefs of the organization. So just if you wouldn't mind, because it gives me a sense of how deep to dive in on these. The question is, does your company have a vision, first off? And the second one is, do you feel like your vision actually comes to life at work? Okay, so yes or no. the idea here is you might see other places too that your vision comes to life. And then, so that's the third question. Are you personally motivated by your company's vision? Okay. So does your company have a vision that's been clearly communicated to you? First one. Second one is, do you think your company overall is living their vision? And the third one is, do you personally feel engaged in your company's vision? I'm just going to give a few more. I'm seeing our responses pop in. This is fantastic. Good. Got 15 so far. I'm going to give everybody just one more minute on the poll questions here. We'll talk about why this is so important. Okay. Well, we're up to 17. That might be all we're going to get right now, which is just fine. So the first question is, nearly every company has a vision that's been clearly communicated. And this is really common, right? Oftentimes we have a mission, vision, and value statement. And so this is very, very common to have this. What's interesting, according to our poll results, is that just shy of 60% of people actually feel that that vision comes to life in their workplace. More than 40% don't feel like that comes to life. So that's a bit of a problem. Interestingly, though, and this is very interesting to me, more than 3/4 of you think that you are personally motivated by your company's vision. So this is a good sign. For those of you that aren't, or for those of you that don't see the value of the vision working in your organization, I would encourage you to just sort of consider a couple of things here. When we're talking about a vision, this is really about understanding what we believe. And the idea with when we're thinking about what we as a company or an organization believes, it's the idea that we make that clear declarative statement so that it is meant to influence our behaviors, our actions, how we're going to go ahead and take on the course of business. It can also sometimes, depending on the vision, be used as a measure, as a yardstick to measure our progress. So if you don't believe in your company's vision, or if you're not personally inspired by your company's vision, or you don't think there's enough of the vision that's inspiring the work of others, I'd really encourage you to start thinking about this idea of creating a personal vision for your workplace. I'm not going to ask you to do a vision board, not to worry, I promise. But instead, we're actually going to turn to Simon Sinek, who is he's done a lot of research on workplace culture. And when we're thinking about the vision, when we're thinking about why do I get up, get dressed, come into work every day and do the work that I do, we can do this at any level of the organization, and having a clear vision will definitely help us improve personally over time our leadership characteristics. That's how this all comes back together. When we clearly state our vision, even if it is not our company's vision, even if it is a personal vision, what personally inspires or motivates us, we want to really think about that leadership being outward facing. And we're going to think about why that's important. So Simon Sinek says, when we're thinking about a vision, whether it's a corporate vision or for a personal vision at your work, really focus first on why we're doing what we're doing. Then we can worry about how we're going to do it and exactly what it is that we're going to do. But when we start with focusing on why we do our job, why we want to inspire others, why we want to help nurture the growth and development of others, when we focus on that why, it actually puts our brain, like this process going from why to what is actually a lot more consistent with how our brain works. The fact of the matter is, we're always motivated by our beliefs, why we think we should do something. So to start with what we want to do isn't nearly as helpful as starting from a place of why do we want to do it this way, and then working our way backwards. Okay. Ultimately, we do things because of what they believe. Simon Sinek actually has a great quote in his book. He says, Martin Luther King Jr. started his historical speech with, "I have a dream," not "I have a plan." And it's the idea that when we have a dream, when we have a belief system, that is how we are going to get motivated to actually do the things that need to be done. In a similar, but maybe a little bit not quite as warm way, Dwight D. Eisenhower also said, leadership is the art of getting someone else to do something you want done because they want to do it, right? So both of those quotes really just sort of helping you hopefully understand and reinforce this idea of the belief being central, understanding why we want to do something in a certain way. There's a couple of resources that will be available to you afterwards. One of them is this TED Talks. Matt Beaton is another leadership expert. And so you can have a look there. And then there's this one, if you want just some more ideas about leadership versus management, there's another video clip that we've given you the link for here. I'm going to turn it back to Mackenzie here, but while Mackenzie is doing the last slide, if any of you have any questions, please feel free to start putting them in the chat and I'll do my best to answer them.
I'm up. Thanks everybody for joining today. Yes, I would have said the same thing. If you have any questions or you're thinking about something, feel free to start popping them in so we can answer some questions. I just wanted to take this opportunity to talk about where today's material came from. So here at MacEwan SCE, we do have individual courses and also professional development certificates. The subject matter for today's webinar was taken from our Fundamentals of Management and Supervision course. We do have professional development certificates. I didn't put this on the slide, in both management and supervision and leadership, which has a little bit of course overlap between them because of course it focuses on some of the same things as we've learned today, but that they're very different. So we do have, once you receive the presentation, these are direct links to our website. I've also given you our direct office email and phone number as well if you have any questions about our courses. The Fundamentals of Management and Supervision course is obviously the first course in our Management and Supervision certificate program, but it is also part of our Executive Assistant Professional Development certificate as well. It's actually an elective in that program, but if you're in an administrative role, that's maybe a little higher level where you're possibly still overseeing some other administrative staff, then this is an awesome course as part of that program as well. And with that, we are wrapping up today. I don't see any questions rolling in yet, but maybe we'll leave it open for another minute. If nobody does have questions, then thank you so much for attending today. Everybody stay warm. So let's kick it off.